Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study this morning. This morning we'll be looking at Zechariah chapter 5, verses 5 through 11. Zechariah chapter 5, verses 5 through 11. In case you don't know where the book of Zechariah is, it's a book that's kind of hard to find in the Bible. The last book of the Old Testament is the book Malachi. Zechariah is the book right before Malachi. So if you turn to the end of the Old Testament, or maybe even easier for you, turn to the beginning of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, turn to the book of Matthew. Go back one book, that'll be the book of Malachi, that's the last book of the Old Testament. If you go back one more book then, that's the book of Zechariah. So that's where we'll be at. We'll be in the book of Zechariah chapter 5. We'll be looking at verses 5 through 11 of Zechariah chapter 5. Zechariah 5, 5 through 11 is one in a series of visions that the prophet Zechariah receives from the Lord. This series of visions starts in Zechariah chapter 1 and goes clear through chapter 5. All of the visions in this series, and there's several of them, I'm not sure exactly how many, there's probably 5 or 6 or maybe even more visions in this series. All of the visions in this series are teaching one basic truth. These visions are showing to Zechariah the sins of the nation of Judah, the nation he was going to prophesy to, and not only the sins they committed, but also the results of their sins. So keep that in mind. As you study the book of Zechariah in chapters 1 through 5, what you're reading about is a series of visions to reveal the sins of Judah and the results of those sins. In Zechariah chapter 5, we're looking at verses 5 through 11. It's interesting. In this vision, the basic idea that we'll be looking at this morning is how mankind, because of their sin, we're talking about either individuals or even nations, mankind, because of their sins, can actually build a prison for themselves. Did you ever feel like you were building a prison, holding you back and encasing you? Well, let me tell you, the Bible makes it plain. It's possible. It's possible to live our lives in such a way that it's as if we're building a prison for ourselves. And that's what this vision in Zechariah 5, 5 through 11 is teaching us. It's teaching us about the prison made from our own sins. Listen to what's said in Zechariah chapter 5, verses 5 through 11. Remember, this is a vision that God is giving to the prophet Zechariah. He's giving it through an angel. Okay, so when you read about this angel here, it's an angel that's talking to Zechariah. He's describing a vision that God has given to Zechariah. Zechariah 5, 5. Then the angel that talked with me went forth and said unto me, Lift up now thine eyes and see what this is that goeth forth. So here the angel is telling Zechariah, Zechariah, the Lord has another vision for you. You need to pay attention to this vision because the message of this vision is very important. You need to pay attention to this vision because it's going to help you as you minister then to the people of Judah. In verse 6, And I said, What is it? And he said, This is an ephah that goeth forth. He said, Moreover, this is their resemblance through all the earth. Okay, let's stop right there. As the angel is giving this vision to Zechariah, the angel says, first of all, Zechariah, what you're seeing is an ephah. Okay, what is an ephah? Back in those Old Testament days, an ephah was a big container they used to hold grain. Depending on what source you use, this container might have been as small as a 1 bushel container that we're all familiar with if we live on farms, up to as many as 3 bushels of grain. So depending on, like I said, what historic reference you use, as the people try to describe the size of an ephah, Most of the references say it holds between 1 and 3 bushels of grain. So I'm going to leave that up to you, whatever you want to make it. But it was a big container. We all know what a bushel basket is. It was a big container. It held up to 3 of those filled with grain. So the angel tells Zechariah, what you're seeing is this container that holds grain. It's an ephah. He said, moreover, this is their resemblance through all the earth. The angel tells Zechariah, what you're about to see doesn't simply apply to Judah, but it applies all over the earth. So, Zechariah, the lesson you're going to learn from this vision not only teaches you truth about Judah, a truth you need to be sharing with Judah as you minister to them, but this applies to all nations. Okay, verse 7. Behold, there was lifted up a talent of lead, and this is a woman that sitteth in the midst of the ephah. Okay, here you got this big bushel container holding grain. There's a piece of lead over the mouth of that container so nobody could see in the container. The angel now lifts up this talent of lead. A talent was about 125 pounds. So he lifts this lid of lead that weighed 125 pounds off the bushel basket. Zechariah is able then to look in the basket. And what's he see? A woman that sitteth in the midst of the ephah. Okay, so if you can picture this, you got this big container for grain. There's grain in the container probably. Even though this vision doesn't actually say there's grain, I'm going to make the assumption there was probably grain in this thing. In the middle of this thing, you have a woman sitting on the grain. But it's covered with this big piece of lead that weighs 125 pounds. So as the angel is describing this to Zechariah, the angel lifts up this big piece of lead to let Zechariah look down in the basket. And what does he see? A woman sitting in the basket, again, probably sitting on grain that's in the basket. Okay. He goes on. And he said, this is wickedness. And he cast it into the midst of the ephah. Okay, so what happens? This woman that Zechariah sees in the basket, the angel reaches down, pulls her up out of the basket, and says to Zechariah, this is wickedness. Meaning, the woman represents wickedness. Then he casts her back in the middle of the basket. He throws the woman back into the middle of the basket. And he casts the weight of the lead upon the mouth thereof. Not only does he throw the woman back in the basket, but this angel then throws this piece of lead back on the top of the basket. So the woman cannot escape. So basically, this woman that represents wickedness is now encased, imprisoned, if I can use that term, in the basket with the lead on top of the mouth of the basket, so heavy she can't get out. That's the vision that the Lord gave to Zechariah. Now, if you're like I am, when you first read this thing, you just have to sit back and say, what is going on? But if we take our time and if we study this prophecy, this vision that God gave to Zechariah, I think it makes a whole lot of sense what is happening. You might say, okay, well, now how can we know what's happening here? Well, by God's grace, the angel actually describes what is taking place. In verse number 9 now, the angel gives a description of what we've just seen. Then I lifted up mine eyes and looked. And behold, there came out 2 women, and the wind was in their wings. For they had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the ephah between the heaven and the earth. Okay? The vision now comes to a conclusion. Zechariah sees 2 women come out. It says that they had wings like a stork. So you have these 2 women coming out, each with a pair of wings like a stork's wings. They walk over to this basket with the lead weight on top of it. They lift up the basket between the earth and the heavens. So in other words, they take it off of the earth and they're holding it up now between the earth and the heaven. Okay, so now Zechariah, who is as confused as we are at this point, asked the question, then said I to the angel that talked to me, whither do these bear the ephah? He says, who are these people and what are they doing lifting this ephah up off the ground? He, that's the angel, said unto me, to build it an house in the land of Shinar, and it shall be established and set there upon her own base. The angel says the reason why this basket is lifted up off the earth is to allow a worship house for God to be built in the land of Shinar. The land of Shinar back then was partially the land area of Babylon. If you remember, back in those days, Babylon was the absolute center of idolatry, of false worship. Back in Babylon throughout, from the Tower of Babel on, the land area of Babylon was the seat of idol worship throughout the Old Testament. So the angel says to Zechariah, one of the reasons why this is taking place, the basket is being lifted off the earth, is so that God's house can be built in the land of Babylon. God's house being a center for true worship. Okay? Okay, what are we looking at here? What is all of this about? Okay, basically what we have is this to start with. Remember when the angel lifted up the woman out of the basket and said, this is wickedness? That's one of the great keys to this vision, to understand it. The woman was a representation of Judah in her wickedness. A sinful Judah. A Judah who was living in sin, and they could care less. They had no desire to change. They had no desire to please their God. They were living in sin. They knew it was sin, and they didn't want to change. It's interesting how, again, if you remember, this woman is sitting in a basket filled with grain. If you look at Zephaniah, not Zechariah, the book we're in, but in Zephaniah, that's a few books prior to Zechariah. Just write this down, Zephaniah chapter 1 and verse number 12. There's a verse there that describes the same nation of Judah and the fact that they don't care about the sins they're committing. Listen to how it's put in Zephaniah 1:12. It shall come to pass at that time that I will search Jerusalem with candles and punish the men that are settled on their lees. When they used to make wine back then, a part of the process of making wine was yeast was made during the process of making wine. That yeast would settle to the bottom of the wine containers. Okay, they would pour the wine off and leave the yeast. Okay, the reason why I'm saying that is, that explains what lees are. When it says the men are settled on their lees, that's the yeast that is at the bottom of the wine bottles. They pour the wine off to be able to drink it, and what would be left would be the lees. Yeast throughout the Bible, or leaven throughout the Bible, many times, not every time. Sometimes it's a picture of the gospel going into the world, but in general, leaven is pictured as sin throughout the Bible, or sin is pictured as leaven throughout the Bible. So here in Zephaniah 1:12, when it talks about men being settled on their lees, the idea is this. Judah at that point in time was committing sin, and they saw no problem with that. They were settled on their lees. They were sitting there settled, not wanting to move, not wanting to change. It even goes on in this verse in Zephaniah. It says, the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil. They didn't even believe the Lord is going to judge them for their sin. That sure sounds like this woman sitting on the grain, doesn't it? You know, when I first read this about the woman sitting in this bushel basket, that's when the first thing that came to my mind was she's like these men that were settled on their lees. They were just sitting there not wanting to change their sinful condition. So you've got this woman, Judah, in a sinful condition. The angel reaches down, pulls her out of the basket, shows Zechariah, this is sinful Judah, in other words. And he casts her back in the basket and throws this lead weight back on top of the basket. Why? He's exhibiting the fact that the sinful Judah had now become imprisoned by her own sin. Because of her sinfulness, she now was sitting in this basket with the lead weight on top, simply awaiting God's judgment. It's like she was in God's holding cell, awaiting his judgment for their sins. Okay, then remember these two women in verse 9 that come out with the wings. It says they had wings like a stork. Okay, now to me that's very important. What do these two women represent? These two women are servants of the Lord. You know, in case we think that the Bible only pictures women as being wicked, you know, for example, the harlot of Revelation. In this case, you have the woman sitting in the bushel basket that's a picture of sinful Judah. I've heard some people say, well, the Bible only uses women to picture sinful people. That's not so. That's not so at all. In this very same vision that you have one woman representative of Judah's sinfulness, you have two women representative of what? Servants of Jehovah, delivering God's judgment upon his people. So these two women come with stork wings. What's the idea of the stork wings? Well, if you study a stork in the Bible, it's real interesting. The stork is only mentioned maybe 3 or 4 different times in the entire Bible. One time the stork is mentioned, it's emphasizing the stork's wisdom in Jeremiah 8:7. When it says these women have stork's wings, what it's saying is this: the judgment that God sends upon sinful nations is an act of his wisdom. It's a wise thing for God to do. Folks, God cannot excuse sin, nor can he ignore it. And a part of his wisdom is to punish the sin that has been committed by mankind. Another time a stork is mentioned in the Bible is Psalm 104 verse 17. There a stork is used to illustrate how the Lord meets the needs of his creation. It talks about how the stork, his needs are taken care of by the Lord. What's that teach us? When the Lord judges sinful Judah, he was actually meeting their needs. And here's how it works. If the Lord never judged the sins of the nation of Judah, just like if he never judged the sins of the other nations that exist on the earth, that sin would only get greater and greater and greater in their nation. But in many cases throughout history, when God judged a nation due to their sin, do you know what that did to the nation? Brought them back to him. It was something that was necessary for him to do. It was for the good of the nation to have their sin judged. How about this? In Leviticus 11:19 and also Deuteronomy 14:18, the stork is included in a list of birds that the Old Testament Jews should not eat. Okay, what's that a picture of? These two women with the stork's wings? What the Lord is saying is, look, this judgment from me against your sin is not something you want to partake of. You need to try and stay away from it. You need to do everything you can in your life to avoid my judgment against sin. How does an individual avoid God's judgment against sin? Or how does a nation avoid God's judgment against sin? By not sinning. It's as simple as that. By making the right choices in life. So what he's saying is this: for a nation that willfully chooses to sin, it is as if they are willfully choosing to have God's judgment fall upon them. Nations should do everything in their power to follow the precepts of the Lord. As a nation, they should follow the footsteps the Lord would have them to follow. They should lead their citizens to lead God-glorifying lives. By doing that, they'll avoid God's judgment against their sin. Finally, in Isaiah 40:31, we find wings and flight being mentioned. If you remember, in Isaiah 40:31, it's kind of a well-known verse to many people. Mounting up with wings as eagles, you shall run and not be weary, you shall walk and not faint. What that's talking about is a Christian who is trusting and relying on the Lord they will be given the inward strength and the spiritual strength they need to be able to get through the trials they face in life, to be able to serve the Lord in great ways, to actually excel over the issues they face in this world. What's that teach us about this judgment from God? It comes as a result of His strength, acting on behalf of His people to bring an end to the sinful condition that nations are in. The whole idea of this vision that Zechariah received is this. Because of Judah's lax attitude toward their sin, they were going to be punished. They were simply awaiting that punishment now because they didn't care whether they were sinning or not. It's like they were sitting in a prison made up of this bushel basket filled with their sin, with this lead weight on top of them where they can't escape it. It was as if they were in a prison awaiting God's judgment to fall. And a part of that judgment would involve them being removed from their land, getting them out of the way, so the Lord's house of worship could be built in the land and to be built without being hindered by the sin of their nation. That's the general basic idea of this vision that Zechariah received. There's one more thing it's important to understand. Not only did this vision apply to the people in Zechariah's day, and I just explained how that was about Judah's sinfulness and how they would end up being removed from the land, which took place when the Greek Empire came in. They started to remove Judah out of the land, but especially during the Roman Empire that enslaved them next. You know, the different dispersions we read about in the book of Acts, that was all under the Roman Empire's rule when the Jews were chased out of Israel. It did cause the gospel to spread because of those dispersions. But the point is, God removed them out of their land because of the sinfulness of their nation. Not only does it apply historically in that way, but I believe there's another application as well. There's coming a day that's yet in the future when the Lord's going to remove all the sin out of our world. It's going to take place during the Great Tribulation and the Battle of Armageddon. By the end of the Battle of Armageddon, which takes place at the very end of the Great Tribulation, by the time that battle is over with, all the forces of wickedness will be put to an end. Then the Lord will usher in a time period on the earth when He will be worshipped perfectly on the earth. Some people call that the 1,000-year reign. Now, I'm not sure if it's going to be a literal 1,000 years because the number 1,000 throughout the Bible is symbolic of everything. But in either case, the point is there will be a period of time when God's worship will be perfect on this earth. Even in places that were the seat of idolatry, such as Babylon, you're going to have God's worship now taking place. You will no longer have evil on the earth to hinder or to oppose God's worship. I think that's a picture, it's a shadow of even that event that's going to take place that's even future to us. So not only was this literally fulfilled during the times of Zechariah forward through the times of the book of Acts, but I believe this prophecy also was at least a foreshadowing of what's to take place in our future. As we end our study, I would just like to ask you to think about something. What Zechariah talked about happening in the nation of Judah, is it happening in our nation, the United States, right now? It seems like more and more the United States is accepting sin. It's accepting sinful practices. It doesn't care anymore. It doesn't care about abortion. It doesn't care about homosexuality. It doesn't care about all of the corruption that's taking place in politics. Our nation just doesn't care about a lot of things that it should care about. Could it be that the Lord's going to treat our nation much like He did the nation of Judah? Okay, how did He treat them? Remember, it's like we're building a big prison because of our national sins. And it's like we're in a waiting period, just waiting for God's judgment to fall. And by the time that judgment is done, what will be the result? Could it be that the United States is going to be just taken off the scene? Maybe not literally, where there won't be a United States anymore. I mean, it could be, but not necessarily. It could be that we're just not relevant in the world anymore. We're no longer an economic power. We're no longer a military power. Could it be that that's where we're headed? I believe that's a real possibility. You can see with the economy, the way things are, with the indebtedness of our nation, folks, we're quickly losing our status as a world power. Even people that have no concept of the religious truths of the Bible, they'll even tell you, just from a secular standpoint, the country of China, the country of India, the country of Russia, they're all on the way up. They're beginning to gain more and more power, and the United States, as the only superpower left, is losing its power. Could it be because we've allowed sin in our midst, just like the people of Judah did? Could it be that because we no longer care about our sins as a nation, that that's where we're headed? To, at the least, a status of being irrelevant in the world, and at the most, totally going out of existence? I think it's really something that we need to consider as Christians in our nation, and it's something our nation as a whole needs to consider. Folks, why is it our nation is decreasing in power? Why is our nation in the state it's in? I say, based on what the Bible says, it's because we've allowed sin in our nation. We're not dealing with that sin, and because of that, our nation is going down. We've made a prison for our nation of its sins. And we are now being held in that prison of sin, awaiting God's judgment. As Christians in the nation of America, we need to be in prayer for our country. We need to be in prayer not only that we would see the sin that we're committing as a country, but then that we do something about it. We turn from those sins. We turn back to the Lord of our founding fathers, and we begin to follow the teachings and the desires that our founding fathers had for our country. Because, folks, we have totally corrupted what our founding fathers have stood for. We've totally twisted and perverted their writings. And because of that, I believe we're in the shape we're in, and we're headed for the end that we're headed for. Please be in prayer for our country, and be in prayer for our families. Because to a certain extent, it's because our families have allowed sin in them to exist that we now have a country that's filled with sin. If our families all did what was their responsibility to do, our country would never be in the shape it's in. So really, if you want to get to the root of the problem, it's because we've allowed sin in our families that our country now has sin in it. Please be in prayer for our country. Please be in prayer for our families. Please understand that even though it might not be the literal fulfillment of this prophecy, at least the spirit of the prophecy is a country that turns from the Lord will be punished by the Lord and taken off the scene. Please understand that's the principle of this prophecy of Zechariah. And I do believe that that's very easily can apply to our country today. May the Lord bless you as you study His Word.